May 1945. A sprawling, chaotic logistical rail hub in Frankfurt. Rain beats down on a concrete platform where thousands of emaciated American soldiers shiver under thin wool blankets. They are newly liberated prisoners of war, their rib cages visible through shredded uniforms, waiting for transport to military hospitals. Steam rises from a long line of idle passenger trains sitting on the adjacent tracks. The locomotives are fired up, their heavy iron boilers warming the air, but the doors remain locked. Armed guards stand at the boarding gates, keeping the freezing, starving men away from the heat. A senior transportation officer stands inside a dry, heated office overlooking the tracks, pointing to a stack of official manifests. He flatly refuses to release a single car for the wounded, declaring that the machinery of reconstruction cannot wait for broken men. General George Patton is already on his way to rewrite that ledger. This is the story of the logistics crisis when Patton forced bureaucrats to prioritize returning prisoners. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. First Lieutenant David Thorne was 26 years old, from the south side of Chicago, and an officer in the 106th Infantry Division. He had a young wife named Eleanor, and a 2-year-old son he had only seen in grainy photographs. Before the war, he worked as a clerk at a rail freight office, a quiet man who kept meticulous ledgers. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor because he believed in simple duty. 5 months earlier, during the bitter freezing chaos of the Ardennes, his regiment was surrounded and cut to pieces. Thorne survived a brutal 300-mile winter death march into the heart of Germany, sustained only by thoughts of his family. Now, he weighed barely 100 pounds, his skin was a bruised translucent gray, and his tattered olive-drab uniform hung loosely off his skeletal shoulders. He was desperately trying to keep his dying men alive on the concrete platform, begging the armed station guards for blankets or a single warm room. Major General Carlton Smythe was 55 years old, from a wealthy banking family in Boston, and served as a senior director within Logistics Command. He had spent the entire war inside heated headquarters, far behind the firing lines, wearing a pristine, custom-tailored uniform with deeply polished leather boots. Smythe was a cold, calculating numbers man who viewed the entire global conflict through the narrow lens of a corporate balance sheet. He possessed an unearned privilege born of political connections, and he openly despised the messy reality of frontline combat. He believed that the post-war world would be won not by sentimentality, but by capturing industrial assets before the Soviet Union could seize them. To Smythe, human beings were entirely replaceable, while physical machinery and intellectual patents were irreplaceable. He sat inside his warm office, insulated from the suffering outside, firmly convinced that the men could wait, but the assets could not. By May 1945, the European theater was a vast landscape of absolute logistical devastation. Germany had collapsed into total ruin, its cities reduced to mountains of brick rubble, and its administrative networks completely smashed. The Allied advance had broken the country apart, leaving millions of displaced persons, liberated forced laborers, and surviving prisoners wandering the torn countryside without food or shelter. The entire transport system was paralyzed by destroyed bridges, cratered roads, and burned-out marshalling yards. In this frantic race against time, the American military machine faced an overwhelming task that went far beyond mere combat operations. High Command had to simultaneously feed starving populations, restore basic municipal utilities, and secure the advanced scientific achievements of the fallen Reich. Thousands of technical intelligence teams were sweeping through underground factories, seizing jet engine blueprints, chemical patents, and hidden stashes of looted European artwork before the advancing Red Army could claim them for Moscow. This created a massive, systemic bottleneck at every operational rail junction across the American zone of occupation. Staff officers throughout Logistics Command were completely overwhelmed by competing demands for limited freight space and coal. In the chaotic scramble to win the peace, the immediate survival of individual human beings was frequently sidelined by distant planners. Many rear echelon commanders routinely ignored the suffering right in front of them, hiding behind a dense wall of regulations and prioritized shipping manifests. They treated the tragic human wreckage of the conflict as a secondary administrative problem to be solved at some unspecified future date. This bureaucratic coldness had become standard operational procedure across the theater, tolerated by senior leaders who were entirely focused on broad strategic objectives. The desperate plight of the thousands shivering on the concrete platform in Frankfurt was just another file on a crowded desk. Thorne walked slowly up the concrete steps of the station headquarters, his breath visible in the damp, freezing air. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the logistics office, his boots leaving trails of gray mud on the floor. Major General Smythe sat behind a wide oak desk, nursing a steaming mug of black coffee while reviewing a stack of stamped shipping manifests. Thorne stood at attention, his hollow chest heaving as he saluted the immaculate commander. "General, I have 300 men on the platform who will not survive the night without shelter or warmth," Thorne said. Smythe did not look up from his paperwork, his fingers moving a gold pen across the page. "Your men are not on my manifest." "Lieutenant," Smythe replied, "they are American soldiers, sir, liberated from Stalag 9B, Thorne said, his voice trembling. "They are starving, and the passenger cars outside are completely empty." "Those cars are allocated for Operation Paperclip and the Monuments Preservation Initiative," Smythe said, turning a page. "I have direct orders from Washington stating that all rolling stock in this sector must be used immediately to transport captured German industrial patents and recovered art collections back to Paris. With respect, sir, the machinery can sit in the rain, but the men are dying of exposure right now," Thorne said, stepping closer to the desk. "You lack the broad perspective required for this theater," Lieutenant Smythe said, finally looking up with a cold, level stare. "This war is over, and the future is about securing strategic dominance, not coddling broken infrastructure. A machine tool or an advanced aviation blueprint is worth more to the long-term security of the United States than a private who couldn't avoid capture in the Ardennes. The men can wait, but the assets cannot." Thorne stared at the general, his hands clenching into tight fists at his sides. "That is an illegal refusal of medical evacuation for wounded personnel, sir," Thorne said. Smythe smiled thinly, tapping the thick stack of papers on his desk. "My authority comes directly from the logistical command staff in Washington," Smythe said. "I suggest you return to your men and keep them quiet before I have my guards remove you from this station for insubordination." This conversation is finished. Thorne turned on his heel and walked out of the warm office, his heart pounding against his ribs. He bypassed his own company commander and went straight to the communications tent at the far end of the rail yard, flagging an emergency priority dispatch. The message detailing the refusal reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the platform within the hour. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and his signature ivory-handled revolvers rested in the holsters on his belt. The engine cut out, leaving only the sound of heavy boots clicking against the wet concrete as the general walked in unannounced. Every man in the room froze, the administrative clerks dropping their pens as the operational climate vanished. Patton did not raise his voice. He walked directly to the oak desk and looked down. "Are you the officer responsible for locking these passenger cars?" Patton asked. "I am, General," Smythe said, standing and straightening his jacket. "I am executing theater priority orders, and those orders dictate that wounded men freeze while empty trains sit idle," Patton asked, his voice low and level. "The orders prioritize industrial assets and historic cargo over local transport requests," Smythe said, pointing to the paperwork. "It comes from high command." "You believe a crate of German blueprints holds more value than a division of infantry?" Patton asked. "Logistically speaking, yes," Smythe replied. "The machinery is irreplaceable for the post-war economy." Patton studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing to cold slits. "You sit in this heated office with a full belly and a clean uniform, telling me about the post-war economy." Patton said, "You look at a man who survived a winter death march, a man who gave his flesh to hold the line at the bulge, and you see a bad entry on a balance sheet. You have spent this war counting crates, while better men were being torn apart by artillery." "The orders are explicit regarding the preservation of technical patents," Smythe said, his voice tightening. I am simply following the directive. Your directive is garbage because it forgets the only asset that won this war, Patton said. The men on that platform built the roads you drive on and captured the very machinery you are hoarding. Without them, your precious patents would still belong to the Reich, and you would be counting pencils in a prison camp. You have a choice, Patton said, leaning over the desk. You will unlock those warm passenger cars and load every single wounded soldier within the next 10 minutes, or I will dismantle your entire operation. Decide now. Smythe remained silent, his jaw clenched as he stared back. Patton turned toward the infantrymen standing by the door and gave a single, sharp nod. The heavily armed soldiers instantly moved out onto the tracks, their rifles slung over their shoulders as they breached the freight cars. Massive wooden crates containing advanced German machinery, lathe tools, and aircraft blueprints were hoisted to the doors and violently thrown down onto the dirt tracks. The expensive crates split open upon impact, scattering millions of dollars in industrial prototypes into the mud and rain. Patton then walked back into the office, grabbed the pristine logistics staff by their uniform lapels, and shoved them toward the exit. He forced Major General Smythe and his clean-shaven officers out onto the concrete platform, ordering them to physically carry the emaciated prisoners of war into the warm passenger cars. Smythe stumbled in his polished leather boots, gasping under the weight of a shivering private who weighed less than 80 pounds. The liberated soldiers watched in stunned silence as the senior logistics staff labored in the freezing downpour, their custom-tailored uniforms becoming soaked with rain and filth. Patton stood over them on the concrete platform, his ivory revolvers catching the dim light as he watched the redistribution of theater assets. First Lieutenant David Thorne returned home to the south side of Chicago in the winter of 1945, slowly rebuilding the body that had been broken in the frozen camps. He went back to his job at the rail freight office, using his meticulous eye for detail to manage the bustling post-war American economy. He raised his son, grew old with Eleanor, and spent his weekends volunteering at the local veterans hospital, where he quietly brought extra wool blankets to the wards. He never spoke about the freezing concrete platform in Frankfurt, but he kept a small, rusty iron railway spike on his desk until his death in 1992. Major General Carleton Smythe faced a quiet, bureaucratic reassignment before the end of 1945. Stripped of his prominent logistical command and tucked away in an administrative dead end in Virginia. His political connections faded in the shadow of Patton's public outrage, and his long-held banking ambitions collapsed under the weight of his stained reputation. He retired early, living out his remaining years in a bitter, isolated house in Boston, where he frequently wrote angry, unread letters to the Department of the War until he passed away in 1974. General George Patton never mentioned the confrontation in his official operational reports, keeping the entire file locked away inside his personal desk drawer. He wrote a single sentence about the incident in a private letter to his wife, noting that some men are born to count things, while others are born to remember that the things must be worth counting. Some historians have argued that Major General Smythe was merely acting as a dedicated, efficient administrator operating under the incredibly chaotic conditions of post-war occupation. They contend that his strict adherence to theater priorities was necessary to secure vital technological assets that ultimately protected Western strategic interests during the subsequent decades of the Cold War. Conversely, other military historians have argued the opposite, insisting that the complete abandonment of humanitarian obligations in favor of material cargo represented a critical moral failure within the upper echelons of Allied logistics command. What is certain is that Patton's explosive intervention at the Frankfurt rail hub established a lasting operational precedent across the entire theater, forcing every subsequent logistical planner to remember that returning prisoners were the Army's most valuable asset. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have filed a formal complaint through the proper bureaucratic channels? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.